The Persecutor's Daughter by Charles J. Peterson, from Graham's Magazine, December 1842. The last days of November are at hand, and the melancholy woods, shorn of their foliage, stand skeleton-like against the cold, lowering sky, or toss their branches to and fro with a low moaning sound in the fitful tempest. Hark! How the gale swells out with the deep voice of a cathedral organ, or dies plaintively away like the cry of a lost child in the forest. The sky is covered with cloud rifts of a deep leaden colour, only a spot of blue sky being here and there visible, but occasionally the sun, bursting like a god from the darkness that encircles him, covers the brown hills with an effulgent glory, while the opposite firmament is lit up with a dull, fiery glow that has something almost spectral in its aspect. The streams are swollen and discoloured, and roll their turbid waters hoarsely onward. Along the fields the brown grass whistles in the wind, and the bare flower stalks rattle with a melancholy tone in the garden. Now and then drops of rain plash heavily to the ground. The wind comes with a sudden chill to the nerves, the bay is crisped into foam by the fitful gusts, and along the bleak coast the now mountain waves roll in with a hoarse, sullen roar, forewarning us of shipwreck and death. Sad thoughts insensibly possess the mind, and tales of sorrow that had long been forgot come up to our memories. One such is even now heavy on our heart. Listen, and we will rehearse it. It was on just such a morning as this, many a long year ago, and far away from our own happy land, that a little congregation was gathered together in the hills to worship God. The time was in those sore and evil days when the decree of a tyrannical king had gone forth that no man should worship, except as a corrupt hierarchy and lascivious court might ordain, and when, all over Scotland, those who would not give up the free birthright of their fathers were driven to meet in mountain glens and on lonely moors, whither their pastors, the holy men who had baptized them in infancy and united them to the dear objects of their love, had already been hunted, and often in solitary places, where hitherto only the cry of the eagle had been heard, the Sabbath hymn rose sweetly up from tender maidens and tearful wives, while their brothers and husbands listened with weapons in their hands, or watched from some neighbouring eminence, lest the fiery dragoons of Claverhouse should be in sight. And when these God-defying troopers, with hands red with the blood of the saints, burst into the little flock, woeful was the tale, and loud the wailing that went through all the vales around. Every new Sabbath brought its tale of slaughter, until the land smoked with blood, and the incense thereof went up from 100 hills, crying for vengeance to the Most High. And such a congregation had now met in the hollow of 3 hills, far away from the usual track of the persecutors. A simple rock served the hoary-headed pastor for a pulpit, while hard by, a rivulet, brawling over its pebbly bed, and then for a moment expanding into a mimic lake, bottomed with silvery sands, formed the holy font for baptism. Around was gathered the little flock, aged sires and young striplings, staid matrons and meek-eyed maidens, young children and stalwart men, all gazing upward into the pastor's face, a sacred throng. But there was one other there, who seemed equally with him an object of anxious interest, and on whom every eye was occasionally turned, a bright, beautiful being, with far more of heaven than earth in her deep azure eyes. Oh, lovely was that fair-haired girl, even as we may have dreamed a seraph to be, all glorious with golden wings under the throne of God. And now there sat in those soft blue eyes an expression of meek sorrow, tempered with high and holy faith, for many and sore had been the trials of Helen Grammy. But grace had been given her to endure them all, and even to rise above them, with a courage which had made her dear unto every heart among these wandering and persecuted ones. The father of Helen was the last son of a family which had been decaying for centuries, and which, of all its once mighty possessions, retained only the comparatively small estate of Craigburney in one of the southern counties of Scotland. To rebuild the fortunes of his house had been the darling wish of her father. For this purpose he had entered the army of the Covenanters during the wars of the Great Revolution, and served with some distinction, though without permanent advantage, in consequence of the return of the king. On the happening of this event, Mr. Graham retired to his estate, soured and disappointed. Here he would have been far more discontented than he was, but for his wife, a lady of the meekest piety, and whose single-minded charity was known throughout all her native hills, for Mrs. Graham was the daughter of one of the holiest ministers of the kirk, and inherited not only his piety, but the fervent admiration with which he was regarded by his parishioners. She early instilled into her child the pure precepts of our holy religion, and often might the little girl be seen seated at her mother's knee, lisping the word of God, which the parent taught her thus early to peruse, and, on the Sabbath, who listened more attentively to the venerable pastor, or joined with sweeter voice in the anthem of praise. Nurtured thus, what wonder that at 17 she seemed the counterpart of the mother, and was regarded by the poorer folk around the Bray, her mother's birthplace, and where she spent several months each year, almost with veneration, for had not many of them in times of sore trial been sustained by the bounty and cheered by the smiles of the heavenly girl? But at length her mother fell sick, and for many a weary month Helen watched by the sufferer's bedside, a ministering angel. During this illness she noticed that at times her father would seem lost in thought, as if something weighed heavily on his mind. But Helen regarded it little, attributing it to his suspense at her mother's danger, for he loved both her and his child with an intensity seemingly in contradiction to his hard, unbending character, but which, in truth, was the result of his total seclusion from the world. For the sympathies thus shut out from others lavished themselves wholly on his wife and daughter. At length Mrs. Graham died, and for many days it seemed as if that strong man's heart would break, while Helen wept in silence, though not less uncontrollably. Her father was now sterner than ever, though not to her. He was more alone, often indulged in fits of musing, and was absent at Edinburgh for some days, an unusual occurrence, and when he came back it was as Sir Rowland Graham, a title which men said he had purchased by selling himself to the court. Helen heard these rumours, which, however, came to her ears in whispers, and which at first she could not believe, with sorrow and despair of heart, but no word of reproof broke from her lips. Her sufferings were endured silently, but so deep was her grief that she pined away, seeming to all eyes a being lent awhile to earth, and gradually exhaling to heaven. Her father, thinking her sorrows sprung wholly from her mother's death, and wishing, perhaps, that she should be from home when he should first act for the government, sent her to her mother's native vale, alleging and doubtless hoping that change of air would restore her to health. It were doing him no more than justice to say that his paternal love was fully aroused to Helen's danger, and that he took the only possible means to keep at his side this dear bud of her who was now in heaven. He forgot how much the little family at the Bray leaned toward the persecuted sect. He forgot the disaffected character of the district into which Helen went. He forgot the danger lest her own feelings should become enlisted in behalf of those against whom he was so soon to draw his sword. Remembering only, for was he not a father, that his child's health was in danger, and that a residence in the mountain district where she had been born, and where she had spent so many happy years, was the sole chance of saving her life. And now Helen was once more amid the scenes where her childhood had been spent, and every old counsel and prayer of her mother, recalled to mind by the spots where they had been first heard, rose up before her, and softened her heart. And often, at Sabbath eve, or in the still watches of the night, it seemed to her as if the spirit of that sainted mother hovered over her, whispering her heavenward, and bidding her never to forget or forsake her God. All the sympathies which now surrounded her drew her to the persecuted sect, for her cousin and aunt were both among the nonconformists. And though the little kirk, standing all alone in the hills, a cool well in a parched desert, was now closed, and he who had formerly ministered there an outcast, yet the sight and recognition of him at more than one stolen meeting recalled to Helen's mind the time when he blessed her, nestling bird-like to her mother's bosom, she looking the while half affrightedly, yet oh how reverentially, up into the face of the mild old man. And was not her heart softened even to tears when the patriarch, well remembering her, for none did he ever forget, sought her among the crowd, and, laying his hands on her head, blessed her, hoping that God still kept her in the way her mother had trod. From that hour Helen became a changed being. The light-heartedness of youth was gone. She wept often and prayed in solitary places by herself, for lo, the struggle in her bosom between duty to her parent and a higher duty to God waxed stronger and stronger, but daily she yearned more and more to the oppressed remnant, until finally it was whispered in the scattered congregation that the persecutor's daughter, that child of many prayers, was to become a professed member of the flock. And old men and nursing mothers in the church blessed God as they heard it. On this Sabbath morning Helen had for the first time openly attended a meeting in the hills. At first she had come with fear and trembling, but when she saw the looks of kindly sympathy with which all regarded her, she became more composed, and could enter on the holy duties of the day in a fitting mood. And when the aged pastor gave out the hymn, and the congregation joined in the sacred anthem, what voice sang of redeeming love so sweetly as that of Helen? Lo, the vision of light has passed from our souls, and in place of that seraphic countenance, we behold the face of a stern warrior, in every feature of which we read of cruelty and blood. Even now he is hot in pursuit of the suffering remnant, and with his troop of fiery dragoons interrupts the Sabbath quiet of the vales and glens, with the jingling of broadswords and the ribald jests of scoffers. And many a dark-browed peasant scowls on the persecutor as he passes, and prays that God will yet avenge his slaughtered saints. Nor, if the popular rumour is to be believed, is that vengeance altogether withheld, for men say that Sir Rowland Graham, having sold his religion for the paltry honours of earth, has been already cursed from on high, and that sleeping or waking he finds no rest from the stingings of remorse. Yet, like one who has committed the unpardonable sin, he cannot draw back from his career of blood, but is impelled onward, as if by some irresistible power, to still darker crimes. Look upon his face again, and tell us if there is not something there which you shudder to behold, something of untold horror in that stern, God-defying brow, as if the arch-enemy had already been suffered to affix his seal upon it. And whither was that man of blood going? Far, far over hill and dale, to the slaughter of the saints. He had heard, through some traitor, of the assemblage to be held that morning in the hills, and with the first dawn of day he and his troopers had been in the saddle, thirsting to participate in the bloody sacrament. For the last half hour he had seemed lost in thought, and now he suddenly drew in his rein and turned to his lieutenant. "Lennox," he said, "I believe I will not lead these brave fellows today, but surrender the command to you. I see, over yonder hill, the blue summit that looks down on the brae, where my daughter is visiting. I have not seen her for months, nor is it probable I shall be in this district for many months more. The country here is widely disaffected, and therefore an unbecoming residence for a child of mine. It has just struck me that I might cross the hills and bring her home with me this afternoon. And yet something whispers to me that I ought rather to pursue these traitors and schismatics," he continued, as if to himself. "However, I can trust to you, and it is imperative that my daughter leave this district. We will meet here by 4 o'clock. Your road lies down yonder glen. All I have to say is, spare none." "I understand," said the subordinate. "Neither age nor sex." "Neither age nor sex, nor even those of rank, if such there be," sternly said Sir Rowland. "When the poison has sunk deep, nothing but the cautery will cure. And hark ye, on the faithful execution of your commands depends your hope of preferment. I would not spare my own child if I found her among these spawn of Satan." And with these memorable words he ordered a detachment of his company to follow him and rode off, though at first reluctantly, in the direction of the brae. The route was passed in silence, for Sir Rowland was buried in thought. There was indeed cause for it. One or two things in the last letter he had received from his daughter, and that missive had now been written a month, made him feel uneasy, lest she looked more favourably on the persecuted sect than became a daughter of his. And it was this fear, all at once recalled to mind by the business on which he had set forth this morning, that determined him so suddenly to leave the dispersion of the conventicle to his lieutenant, while he should ride over to the brae and bring his daughter home. Other thoughts, too, were busy within him. The long, coveted rank had brought little alleviation to his soured and disappointed mind, for his fortune was now more than ever inadequate to his condition, and all the peculiarly sensitive feelings of a proud man were stung to the quick by the indignities to which, in consequence, he was often exposed. Moreover, he was aware of the light in which he was held, since his change of politics, not only by the common people, but by large portions of the gentry, so that, on every hand, he was soured and irritated, and longed to wreak on the Covenanters the hate which he felt toward all men. And yet, as he approached the brae, and saw at a distance the low roof of the mansion from which he had taken his bride, gentler feelings stole into his bosom. He thought of her whom he had once loved with all the fervour of a first passion. He remembered the happy years they had spent together, and when he recollected that she was now no more, and that the last time he had beheld these roofs he had been in her company, a tear almost gathered into his eye. Then he thought of his daughter. As her image rose up before him, his heart was fully melted. With all the sternness of his character, he loved that daughter as few fathers loved. I loved her doubly since her mother's death, for she was now the only object in the whole wide world on which he could bestow aught of affection. And now joy at the prospect of meeting her gave to his spirits the glad exhilaration of boyhood, and quickening his pace, he galloped gaily across the hills, nor drew his rein until he reached the door of the old mansion. The brae was an antique and partially dilapidated residence, at present inhabited by the aunt of Helen, and a daughter about the age of Miss Graham. At all times it wore a sombre, deserted look, but on this morning it seemed peculiarly desolate, for the whole front of the house was closed and all the outhouses shut up. A strange fear came over the father as he beheld the absence of these signs of life, and he hastily ordered one of the dragoons to dismount and knock at the door. The man obeyed, but for a time knocked in vain. The sound of the hilt of his heavy sword striking on the door echoed through the long hall of the house, but no signs of life within were visible. The usual frown on the face of Sir Rowland grew darker, and he cried angrily, "Blow off the lock with a pistol and search the house!" At this instant, however, and just as the trooper was proceeding to execute this order, the face of an old woman was protruded from one of the upper windows, while she demanded who was below. "Sir Rowland Graham," replied the leader. "Where are the family? Where is Miss Graham? Is anyone sick?" "They are all well, but out," briefly said the woman. "Out! Out!" exclaimed the persecutor. "And on Sunday, when there is no church within miles. By he continued, striving to drown his fears in rage. "Is this a time to be out? Where have they gone? Answer truly, on your life." "May it please your honour," said one of the dragoons, touching his cap, "may they not have gone to this conventicle and taken your daughter with them?" Quick as lightning, Sir Rowland wheeled round on the unthinking speaker, and while the indentation on his brow became deeper than ever, and his eye flashed with rage, he said, "My daughter consorting with traitors and schismatics, breathe but the word again, and by the God of heaven I will cleave you to the chine." And his fingers played nervously with the hilt of his sword, but seeing the deprecating look of the trooper, he recovered himself and added, "Tush! Man, you are innocent, but take care how even innocently you rouse the tiger." "Tiger?" shrieked the old woman, who had known Sir Rowland in former days, and who now seemed impelled by some sudden gust of passion to speak out. "It is well said. I, one whose fangs have been in the hearts of the persecuted remnant. But God will avenge his people. Know, false persecutor, that your daughter has gone forth today to become one of the chosen few against whom, O man of sin, you have so often ridden with steel and war-horse, holding the commission of your master, the evil one. Go to, Rowland Graham, I mind ye when ye were a boy, and little did I think ye would ever become the Judas you are now." It is probable that if her hearer had comprehended the whole of this harangue, a bullet would have been the speaker's reward, but the first words of the old woman, when taken in connection with the desertion of the house and his own misgivings from Helen's late letter, assured him that his daughter had indeed attended the conventicle. The conviction fell on his heart with agonizing force. Remembering the injunctions of indiscriminate butchery he had laid on his subordinate, and well knowing that the command would be fulfilled to the very letter, he staggered back in his saddle with a face whiter than ashes, and was fain to grasp the pommel for support, while he exclaimed in tones wrung from him by the keenest anguish, my child, I have murdered my child." "What is that ye say?" screamed the old hag, leaning eagerly forward. "Have ye sent out your reaving dragoons against the Lord's anointed? And ye fear that they will slay your ain bairn? O man of blood, the judgment of God has come upon ye. The judgment has come upon ye." But to the voice of the speaker, as well as to the astonished looks of the dragoons, the father was insensible. He still remained clutching the saddle, every feature of his face working with intense agony, and his eyes glaring vacantly on the air. Those who looked on him shrunk back aghast at the horror of his aspect, which, fearful as it was, only faintly shadowed forth the torture of the soul within. The peril of his only child stupefied him for a time. Then a succession of wild images rose up to his mind. He saw his daughter flying before the ruthless dragoons. He heard her cries for mercy, and the bitter sneer of disbelief on the part of her pursuers. He beheld her lying a corpse on the bare heath, her bosom gashed with brutal wounds, and her long fair hair dabbled with blood. In that moment, the memory of everyone whom he had slain came up before him, the mothers who had clung to his knees, the babes who had looked innocently in his face as they died, the daughters whose aged parents he had slain before their eyes. He thought of the silvery-headed patriarch whom he had shot for refusing the test, and the prophetic warning of the victim that he, even he, the proud persecutor, should curse the day he ever drew his sword against the saints, came up to his memory. He groaned in anguish. For a time none dared to intrude on his misery. One of his men, a trusty body adherent, at length ventured to speak, by asking him if they had not better ride with all haste after Lennox, in the hope that they might yet come up in time. Starting as if a shot had struck him, the father plunged his rowels into the side of his steed until the blood gushed forth, and wheeling his horse sharp around, looked back sternly on his followers, as he led the way at a fearful pace up the hill. Well did he know the country around, and necessary indeed was that knowledge, for his frantic gallop required the most intimate acquaintance with every turn and inequality of the road. Over hill and dale, through glen and moor he dashed, reckless of danger, for how could he think of aught but his daughter. Oh, what would he not have given to be assured that he should once more look into her soft blue eyes, that he should again press her to his bosom? What now to him was rank or wealth? Perhaps he thought that Helen would be able to reveal her name ere she fell a victim. But no, for even if she spoke, would his subordinate believe her story? Once, the very suspicion that she favoured the Covenanters had angered him, but now he would forgive everything, only to be assured of her safety. The contending emotions, hope and fear, love and anger, suspense and despair, that agitated his bosom, made that hour's ride an hour of agony, such as he had never before thought a human being could endure and live. He felt that the curse of God was on him, that all the agonies he had inflicted on others were now concentrated on himself, that he was bound to the wheel of fire. His punishment had already begun. He had rushed against the thick bosses of the Almighty's buckler, and found, like him of old, that man could not contend against the Most High. We remember, when a boy, waking from a dream of horror, to find our mother smiling over our sleep. Oh, never shall we forget the heavenly radiance of that loved face, for radiant with heaven it seemed to us, after the terrors of that midnight vision. Even so we feel when turning from contemplating the tortures of the persecutor to gaze on his sainted child. The hour was now approaching noon, and Helen, in the presence of the silent flock, had taken upon her those vows she could never put off. Tears fell from many an eye as the worshippers beheld her thus in their midst, and the old pastor was so affected that he could scarcely speak. "God will reward you, my daughter, and give you strength," he said. "I bless his holy name that thou art delivered from the dominion of Baal. It is hard, I know, to disobey a parent. But saith not the Scripture that we must leave father and mother if required, and take up our cross and follow Christ? Only persevere, and God will make your way plain to you, guiding you, even as he led the children of Israel, with a pillar of cloud by day and of fire by night. Trials, and sore ones, we must all have in this world, and I boast not, but only speak to cheer you, when I say that mine have been many and hard, but God has given me grace to endure all, even as he will give it unto you. But my race is nearly run. The golden urn will soon be broken at the fountain. I only pray to die like the martyrs of old, with my armour on, and my sword girt to my thigh. Come, O Lord, most mighty," he continued, raising his hands and eyes rapturously above. "Come, O Lord most gracious, and come quickly." A deep silence followed the conclusion of this prayer, while the tears of many fell fast and thick. Every eye was fixed on the holy man, or turned to Helen, for the countenances of both already seemed to glow as those of angels. None dared to draw a breath, lest they should dispel the hushed stillness that so well accorded with the solemnity of the moment. But suddenly a cry was heard, clear, loud and startling. "The dragoons! The dragoons are here!" And had a voice come from the dead, it would not have produced a more sudden change in the hearers. Everyone started up, and all eyes were turned toward the point whence the cry had proceeded. There, on a gentle eminence, stood a shepherd waving his plaid and making gestures for the congregation to fly up the glen. In an instant all was confusion. Mothers clasped their infants to their bosoms and looked up tremblingly, with faces whiter than ashes. Maidens clung to their lovers and gazed around with dilated eyes and looks of terror, and fathers and brothers, gathering around these dear ones, hurried them on foot and horseback in the direction indicated by the sentinel. The escort of Helen and her aunt had been several armed retainers, and these now rallied to the side of their mistress and the pastor, prepared to make good their retreat or defend themselves to the last. Hoping to escape the notice of the pursuers, they dashed off in a different direction from that pursued by the others of the congregation. But just as they turned the angle of the hill, the pennons of the troopers came into sight, and by the immediate diversion of a party in pursuit of them, the fugitives knew they were detected. Pricking their horses, they now hurried rapidly onward, and for several hundred yards lost sight of their pursuers. At length, the little party reached the brow of a slight acclivity. "Faster, faster," said one who had looked back. "They gain on us! Press on!" Every eye was turned in the direction of the pursuers, and there, not half the distance they had been before, were the dragoons, thundering along with fiery haste. The sight gave new energy to the fugitives, who urged on their steeds with redoubled vigour. For a while now, the result seemed doubtful. During this interval of suspense, the feelings of the fugitives were of the most conflicting character, the instinctive love of life alternating with a holy resignation to whatever fate might be assigned them. Now, as they gained on the troopers, the former prevailed, and now, as they saw their pursuers drawing nigher, the latter won the mastery. The emotions of each, meanwhile, were different. The old pastor, with eyes uplifted, seemed rapturously awaiting martyrdom. The aunt and cousin of Helen were pale and red by turns, as their fear or faith rose triumphant, while the serving men frowned darkly as they looked behind, and appeared to wish for a chance to exchange passes with their steel-clad oppressors. But the feelings of Helen were most difficult to analyze, though perhaps they had less of earth in them than those of any except the pastor. Subdued by the day's sacrifice of herself, and all glowing with divine faith and energy, what had she to fear from death? Yet, even with this perfect resignation, she could not avoid looking back on their pursuers, while her heart beat quicker as the distance increased between the troopers and themselves. "We gain! We gain! Press on! We shall escape!" shouted the leader of the little party. "The Lord will yet deliver us from our enemies." "Nay, nay," said the pastor suddenly, "the hour has come. See ye not that we are cut off in front, lo, the horses and the men of war?" A cry, almost a shriek, broke from Helen's two female companions as they looked ahead and saw, emerging from a narrow ravine, another party of dragoons, led by a tall, dark man far in advance of the rest, and all riding with tumultuous haste. Helen spoke not, but only raised her eyes to heaven, for escape was now impossible. The ravine ahead was the only feasible outlet in that direction, from the glen up which the fugitives had fled, and to turn back would be to fall on the swords of their pursuers. The serving men looked aghast, and drew in their reins, which example the rest of the party immediately followed. For a minute there was a profound silence. At length the leader again spoke. "Why stand we here? Escape is impossible unless we can cut our way through. Let us charge the party behind, for that is the smaller. Form a circle around the women. Wheel, trot." There was no time for consultation, and the proposal seemed to point out the only feasible plan. With the words they wheeled their horses and dashed to the desperate attack. The dragoons seemed for an instant astonished by the movement, but did not slacken their pace. Their leader waved his sword, and turning to his men, led the onset in person, shouting, "God save the king and bishops," while the Covenanters, unsheathing their blades, raised the cry of "The sword of the Lord and Gideon." And thus, borne in the midst of those armed men, as in the embrace of a whirlwind, Helen was hurried toward the dragoons. And as they galloped along, the heavenly girl, with heart uplifted, prayed, while her countenance shone with a glory as of the cherubim. And who was it that dashed so frantically up the glen, as if fearful that he might not arrive to wet his blade in the blood of the fugitives? Who but Sir Rowland Graham, flying to save his daughter, and even now almost maddened with the thought that he had come too late? For the instant that he emerged from the ravine, he recognized his child, and now, when he saw her turned back to the pursuers, and his practiced eye told him that he could not reach her until the two parties should be engaged in deadly combat. The same sickening sensation of horror which had attacked him at the brae came over him again. With a sharp cry of agony, he ploughed his spurs into the already bloody sides of his horse, and sprang forward at a pace even more frantic than that which he had before led. But swift as was his progress, it seemed to him only that of a snail. On, on, he urged his gallant beast, and nearer the fugitives and their first pursuers drew to each other. What though he gained on the group? He saw that the hostile parties would meet while he would yet be far away. Oh, what were his feelings as this conviction forced itself on him? If only another mile in which to overtake them had been given him, he might perhaps have succeeded. But now hope was in vain. Cold drops of sweat stood on his brow, while his heart throbbed almost to bursting against his corslet. Did none recognize him, and could they not understand his frantic signs? He shouted, again, again, again. The dead might as well be expected to hear. He waved his plumed hat on high, but at that instant, with the shock of an earthquake, the opponents met. A dizziness came over his eyes, but with a mighty effort he rallied his reeling faculties and looked at the fight. Was his child yet alive? He saw the gleam of the broadswords, the blaze of firearms, and all the tumult of the conflict, but his daughter was not visible. Suddenly a sharp, quick female shriek, rising shrill over the uproar, met his ear. God of heaven, had his Helen fallen? Another leap of his frantic steed, and he was near enough to hear the shouts of the combatants and distinguish particular persons. He trembled with eagerness, but lo, his daughter was still unharmed, girt around as with a wall of steel by the broadswords of her defenders. He rose in his stirrups at the sight, and waving his hat around his head, shouted with the voice of a Titan, "Joy! Joy!" They recognize him, and his child extends her arms toward him. She is saved. But no, for at this very instant, when at length they understood by their leader's gestures that they were to desist, one of the dragoons, availing himself of the confusion of the moment, and thirsting for vengeance for a wound he had received, aimed a pistol at the pastor's bosom, and though a fellow soldier struck aside his arm, it was only to wing the deadly ball to another heart, even that of Helen, who all along had been nestled by the side of the holy man. She fell back into his arms, the blood gushing from her bosom, and for an instant they thought her gone. But when the pastor called on her name, she faintly opened her eyes, pressed his hand, smiled sweetly, and murmuring of heaven, sank away apparently into a slumber. One wild cry of horror had risen at her fall from those immediately around her, telling the tale of her murder. But the father needed not this confirmation of his worst fears, for he had seen the shot and beheld her fall. Galloping wildly forward, with a few gigantic leaps he reached the offender, whom he smote to the earth with a single blow of his broadsword. The next instant he was by his daughter's side, the group opening awestruck to let him pass. He spoke not, but oh, the terrible agony of his countenance! Putting them aside with arms extended, he approached and gazed down into the face of his child, gazed as Sapphira did when the apostle told her doom, and she saw the bearers returning from her husband's burial, and for a minute of profound silence he continued gazing thus into that fair, sweet face, on which, though now stilled as in death, there yet lingered a smile of heavenly joy. He shuddered as he looked, and his countenance became livid as that of a corpse. He essayed to speak, but though his lips moved, no sound proceeded from them. At length, slowly, almost reluctantly, he stooped down and took her hand. "Helen, Helen," he said in a choking voice, "you are not dead. Say so. Tell me I am not your murderer. Oh, speak, and forgive me." The dying girl faintly opened her eyes and gazed vacantly into her father's face. Her senses were fast deserting her. She did not recognize him. "Oh God, my child is dying," groaned the father. "Helen, Helen," he continued, raising his voice, "do you not know me? I am your father, your murderer. Do not look on me with such strange eyes. Helen, Helen, dear, say, if only by a smile, that you forgive me." "Oh, Lord God of heaven," he exclaimed, lifting his eyes agonizingly above, "have mercy on me. Suffer her to live to forgive me. Crush not the bruised reed." And hot tears gushed from his eyes and trickled in his daughter's face. "Who weeps?" faintly said the dying sufferer. "Weep not for me. Tell my father how I love him, and die blessing him." "Thank thee, Almighty Father, I thank thee," gasped the penitent. "Helen, here is your father. I am he." For the first time now, the dying girl seemed fully to comprehend her situation. She looked a minute around the group, and then, with a sweet smile, her eyes rested on her father's face. She faintly pressed his hand. Tears gushed from his eyes like rain, and though he strove to speak, he could not for his sobs. She murmured of him, of her mother, of heaven, and then they knew she was dead. The father looked on her a moment, and with a groan, which none there ever forgot, sunk helpless to her side. They raised him, but he was a corpse. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and I will repay.